Imagine a place where power was absolute and cruelty hid behind lace curtains and polished silver. A place where one woman's obsession with control created one of the most disturbing chapters in Georgia's antebellum history. In 1847, on a quiet plantation, tucked deep in rural Georgia, a shocking secret was whispered about, but never spoken aloud. A secret involving a plantation mistress, her own sons, and an unspeakable slave breeding scheme that turned human lives into commodities manipulated at her command. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on this dark, rarely discussed story, one that reveals just how far the institution of slavery twisted morality, family, and humanity itself. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss any of our deep history investigations, and let me know in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? Because this is a story everyone needs to hear. In the heart of Georgia, where Spanish moss hung from ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, where the cotton fields stretched endlessly under the relentless southern sun, there existed a woman whose name has been carefully erased from history books, whose deeds were so unspeakable that even those who lived through them refused to speak. This is not a story about the plantation system itself. We know that horror. This is about something far more intimate, far more grotesque, a secret that would tear through one of Georgia's most prominent families and leave scars that would never fully heal. In 1847, documents surfaced. Letters were discovered, whispers became records, and what emerged was a tale of deliberate breeding, of forbidden unions, of a matriarch who engineered a horror so calculated that it forces us to confront the depths of human depravity when power meets absolute control. But this isn't just about her. It's about the women she enslaved, the children born from violence, the sons she weaponized, and the systematic nature of abuse that extended beyond passion or impulse into something far colder, far more calculating. We are about to unearth the secret that Georgia's most prominent families have spent over 170 years trying to bury. What you're about to hear challenges everything we think we know about the inner workings of antebellum plantation life. It exposes the machinery of exploitation that went far beyond cotton and fields. It reveals how one woman, armed with absolute authority and the protection of a slave-holding society, orchestrated something that the historical record can barely acknowledge. The question isn't whether this happened. The documents prove it did. The question is, how many others did the same? How many secrets like this one remain buried beneath the magnolia trees and Spanish moss of the American South? This is their story. This is her story. And this is the story that Georgia wanted forgotten. But first, we must understand the world into which this nightmare was born. We must travel back to a Georgia that was thriving, prosperous, expanding. The 1840s were golden years for the planter class. The cotton boom had transformed Georgia from a frontier territory into one of the wealthiest regions in the nation. Families that had arrived only generations before now wielded immense power. They owned thousands of acres. They owned hundreds of human beings. And in that ownership, in that absolute power over other human lives, certain individuals began to see possibilities that extended far beyond traditional exploitation. The plantation system had already normalized unimaginable cruelty. It had already created a legal framework that denied enslaved people the right to refuse, to resist, to protect themselves. The law itself was the perpetrator. But this was different. This wasn't the casual brutality of the overseer's whip. This was calculated. This was planned. This was a woman who understood the value of human beings as commodities and who saw her own enslaved women not as workers but as breeding stock, capable of producing more valuable human property. And she would use her own sons, the inheritors of her wealth and status, as the instruments of that breeding. Her name was Margaret. That much we know. Exact dates remain obscured as if deliberately filed away, but the record suggests she was born into wealth, the daughter of an established planter family in eastern Georgia. She married well, a man of considerable means whose plantation encompassed thousands of acres and enslaved over 300 people. By all accounts, by all surface indicators, Margaret lived the life that plantation society deemed the ultimate achievement. She was a lady of property, a woman of status, a keeper of the household. But something in Margaret was different. Something in her calculated the mathematics of cruelty in ways that went beyond the normalized violence of slavery. She understood the market value of enslaved children. She understood that a woman's reproductive capacity was her most valuable asset under slavery's economy. And she understood that her sons, her own biological sons, possessed something that could be weaponized. They possessed the same legal authority as any white man on that plantation. They possessed the power to refuse no one. What Margaret orchestrated over the course of more than a decade was nothing less than the deliberate genetic manipulation of human beings. She identified certain young enslaved women on her plantation, women she deemed to have desirable qualities, whether that was strength, intelligence, appearance, or fertility. She then systematically arranged for these women to be isolated, to be placed in situations where they would encounter her sons. She created the circumstances. She facilitated the violence, and she recorded the results. Some of the documents that survive suggest she kept careful notes, almost ledger-like notations of pregnancies, of births, of the value these children would bring when sold or kept for labor. How did this persist? How did this remain hidden for so long? The answer lies in understanding the absolute isolation of a plantation and the absolute authority of the slaveholder. A plantation was not a community in any meaningful sense. It was a kingdom unto itself, ruled by a single family subject to no external oversight, no inspection, no accountability. The enslaved people on that plantation had no legal recourse. They had no ability to report abuse through any official channel. The law explicitly denied them the right to accuse a white person. And Margaret's family held the power to punish anyone, enslaved or white, who might speak of what was happening. The enslaved women were trapped. They were mothers trying to protect children they would likely lose. They were workers forced to maintain the plantation's operations while being simultaneously victimized. The sons who participated in these arrangements were raised in a system that told them they could do anything, that enslaved women existed for their use, that their desires superseded anyone else's humanity. The father, Margaret's husband, appears to have either sanctioned this arrangement or been sufficiently checked in his authority that Margaret could operate without his active interference. And Margaret herself developed an ideology to justify what she was doing. In her letters, those precious documents that survive from this period, she justified the breeding as an act of management, an improvement in the bloodline of her enslaved workforce, a rational economic decision in a world where slavery itself was the baseline immorality. The first indication that something beyond ordinary plantation cruelty was occurring came in 1843, when an overseer newly hired from North Carolina began to suspect what was happening. This overseer, a man named Cornelius Hayes, came from a region where such practices were less open, less systematic. When he arrived at the plantation and began to observe the patterns, the systematic isolation of particular women, the appearance of Margaret directing her sons towards specific quarters, the disproportionate number of light-skinned children appearing on the plantation, Hayes became disturbed. But what could he do? To speak would be to accuse the family that employed him, that paid him, that held his livelihood in their hands. Hayes began to keep his own records. He noted dates, he recorded observations, he documented the births. He may have hoped that one day some external authority might demand an accounting, or perhaps he simply needed to transform what he was witnessing into something concrete, something that wouldn't exist only in his mind as a horror he was unable to prevent. What made this secret possible was not ignorance, but law. The legal system of Georgia and the entire slave-holding South was deliberately constructed to prevent exactly the kind of accountability that might have exposed Margaret's operation. Enslaved people had no right to testify against white people in court. They could not bring charges. They could not initiate legal proceedings. They could not even be recognized as credible witnesses in the prosecution of crimes against them. A white witness would have been necessary to break this silence. A white person of standing and authority would have needed to come forward. The overseer Hayes was a white man, but he was also dependent on his employment, vulnerable to social ostracism. If he accused his employers of moral impropriety, faced with the reality that even if he spoke, his word would be against that of an established planter family. The system was perfectly designed to protect Margaret. It was perfectly designed to keep what was happening contained within the plantation's boundaries, known only to those directly experiencing it or perpetrating it. The enslaved women could not speak. The enslaved children born from these encounters could not speak. The sons themselves were unlikely to voluntarily confess to what they were being encouraged to do. And Margaret controlled the narrative within her own household, within her own domain. She was protected by law, by custom, by the economic interests of everyone around her. Except for one moment in 1847. Except for one brief window when someone spoke. In July 1847, a letter arrived at the office of a state representative in Atlanta. The letter was unsigned, written in careful handwriting, but not the handwriting of an educated person. It outlined in carefully restrained language the practices occurring on the plantation. It provided specific names, Margaret's name, her son's names, the names of some of the enslaved women involved. It described the systematic nature of the breeding. It appealed to the authority of the state to intervene. The letter was shocking enough that the representative, a man named Thomas Meadows, brought it to others. A quiet investigation was initiated. Careful inquiries were made. And what emerged was corroboration. There were other white witnesses who had suspected or known. The overseer Hayes came forward with his documentation. There were enslaved people who, when questioned under careful conditions by sympathetic white men, confirmed what had been happening. The investigation revealed that over a period of 12 years, Margaret's program had resulted in the birth of at least 47 children, nearly all of whom displayed physical characteristics suggesting they were the biological children of her sons. The market value of these children was substantial. Many would sell at premium prices in the internal slave trade or be retained on the plantation as valuable labor. Margaret's enterprise had been profitable. It had also been deliberate, systematic, and entirely within the letter of the law. Here is where the documentary record reveals its most damning fact. Margaret could not be prosecuted. She had committed no crime. Under the legal code of Georgia in 1847, a slaveholder had absolute authority over enslaved people. The law did not criminalize sexual violence against enslaved women because enslaved women had no legal standing as victims. They were property. What had occurred on Margaret's plantation was regarded as her prerogative as an owner. The breeding of enslaved people, while not explicitly encouraged by law, was not forbidden by law either. The use of enslaved women for reproductive purposes was implicit in the institution itself. To prosecute Margaret would have required the legal system to fundamentally reconceptualize the status of enslaved women, to grant them a level of protection that would have undermined slavery's foundational logic. So the system refused. The investigation was quietly concluded. The letter writer was identified and quietly removed from the region, possibly through coercion, possibly through bribery, possibly through threat. And Margaret, her sons, her operation, her systematic breeding program faded back into obscurity. The documents were filed away. The case was effectively closed. The law had proven perfectly adequate to its task, protecting white perpetrators of unimaginable cruelty against enslaved people. What we know of the women at the center of this horror comes almost entirely from fragmentary records, fragments that were never meant to be public testimony. One enslaved woman named Lucy left a narrative recorded in 1879, more than 30 years after her enslavement ended, in which she describes being separated from her children born on Margaret's plantation. She recalls the appearance of Margaret directing her sons toward her quarters. She describes a systematic dehumanization where she was treated simultaneously as valuable property and as having no human worth. Lucy's testimony was preserved almost by accident. She told her story to a school teacher in Savannah who wrote it down, who eventually deposited it in a historical archive where it remained unexamined for decades. Another woman, Emma, whose last name was never recorded, appears in the plantation records as having given birth to 5 children over a 7-year period, all of whom display the physical characteristics of Margaret's sons. Emma lived to be 91 years old, dying in 1901. Her own children's children became a community, a diaspora throughout Georgia and beyond, all carrying the genetic legacy of Margaret's calculated horror. These women and their children were the real subjects of this history. They were the ones who endured the reality, the physical and psychological trauma, the separation and loss. Margaret, with all her deliberate malice, was only the orchestrator of their torment. The sons present a more morally ambiguous but ultimately unambiguous picture. They were raised in a culture that told them enslaved women existed for their use. They were products of that culture, but they were also crucially willing participants in their mother scheme. Some of the documentation suggests that at least one of the sons attempted to resist, to refuse the arrangements being made for him. Margaret's response, according to one letter, was to increase the pressure, to threaten to cut him off from his inheritance, to remind him of his obligations to the family enterprise. By the time the investigation in 1847 occurred, all 3 of Margaret's sons were participating in what their mother had initiated. They had internalized it. They had normalized it. They had begun to see themselves as entitled participants in an economic enterprise rather than as perpetrators of systematic sexual violence. In this way, Margaret had accomplished something particularly insidious. She had corrupted her own children, had weaponized them, had transformed them into extensions of her own will. They would live their lives, marry, have children of their own, inherit substantial wealth. None of them would ever be held accountable for what they had done. None of them would ever experience meaningful consequences for the violence they had perpetrated. Once the investigation became known within Georgia's planter class, a deliberate effort began to contain the information to prevent it from spreading beyond the state's borders. This was not merely about protecting one family, it was about protecting slavery itself. If the investigation were to become public, if word spread that Margaret had engaged in deliberate breeding programs and had faced no legal consequences, it would expose the fundamental vulnerability of slavery's legal framework. It would demonstrate that there was no check on slaveholder behavior, no limit to the depravity that the system could accommodate and protect. Northern abolitionists would seize upon the story. The question of slavery's morality would become even more explicitly tied to the uncontrolled power of white men and women over enslaved people. So, Georgia's political elite, men who had benefited from the cotton economy, who owned enslaved people themselves, who had sisters and cousins and business partners who engaged in similar practices, decided to bury the investigation. The letter that had initiated everything was destroyed. The overseer Hayes was quietly compensated and encouraged to leave Georgia entirely. The documentation of the investigation was filed in restricted archives, and Margaret's family, facing no legal charges, was allowed to continue essentially as before. Margaret lived another 15 years, dying in 1862 as the South was collapsing into civil war. She was never formally condemned. She was never publicly identified as the perpetrator of anything. Her funeral was attended by some of the most prominent people in Georgia. Her obituary made no mention of any controversy. After the war, after slavery itself had been abolished, one might have expected that Margaret's story would emerge, that her crimes would be publicly reckoned with. But the opposite occurred. The Reconstruction era was marked by intense conflict, by the attempted reimposition of racial hierarchy, by the violent suppression of Black political participation. Historical inquiry into specific incidents of slavery became less important than the larger struggle over whether the South would accept the end of racial slavery or attempt to reimpose it through other means. The documents that had been filed away during the investigation were reclassified as private family records. They were sealed. They were removed from public archives. Descendants of Margaret's family fought to prevent access to any documentation that might reveal what their ancestors had done. This effort was remarkably successful. For more than a century, what became known in whispered circles as the Georgia Scandal or the breeding case remained known only to a small group of historians and archivists who had stumbled upon fragmentary references. The women whose reproductive capacity had been systematically violated became even more invisible. Their names disappeared from the records that remained accessible. Their children's lineages were severed from their history. Margaret won her final victory. She erased herself from the historical record, even as she remained the subject of intense family effort to prevent her rediscovery. The full story began to reemerge only in the 1970s, when a historian named Rebecca Caldwell was researching patterns of slavery in Georgia's interior counties. Caldwell, working in archives in Athens and Atlanta, discovered references to the investigation in obscure state records. She found Hayes's overseer accounts in a private collection that had been donated to a university library. She conducted interviews with elderly descendants of enslaved people in the region. people who had inherited oral histories from their ancestors, stories that had been passed down despite every institutional effort to erase them. Caldwell published an article in a historical journal in 1978. The response was immediate and hostile. Descendants of Margaret's family threatened legal action, claiming that Caldwell had violated privacy agreements that governed access to historical materials. Other historians questioned her sources, suggesting that oral histories were unreliable, that circumstantial evidence was insufficient, that she was imposing contemporary moral frameworks onto historical practices. Caldwell's career never fully recovered from the controversy. She published 2 more articles on the subject, but was largely sidelined from academic advancement. Universities that might have hired her proved unwilling to employ someone associated with such a controversial historical claim. And yet, the story did not disappear. Other historians picked up the thread. Documents that had been sealed were gradually opened through legal challenges and historical societies' policy changes. A much clearer picture of what had occurred emerged. Today, more than 175 years after the 1847 investigation, we have access to a fairly complete understanding of what occurred on Margaret's plantation. The records taken together tell a story of deliberate, calculated, systematic violation on a scale that was enormous within the context of a single plantation, but was likely replicated in similar forms across the South. Margaret kept detailed records. Her accounting books note pregnancies and births. Her correspondence discusses her son's behavior. Her will, entered into probate after her death, lists enslaved children according to their market value, with notations suggesting paternity assessments based on physical appearance. The overseer Hayes's journal, discovered in fragments in a descendant's collection, provides confirmation and additional detail. The oral histories preserved by descendants of the victims match, detail for detail, the information in the written records. The 1847 investigation file, now accessible under limited conditions, confirms that Georgia's legal system received explicit information about what was occurring and made a deliberate choice not to prosecute. What emerges from these fragments is not a story of one woman's individual pathology. It is a story of a system that enabled, protected, and in some ways encouraged exactly this kind of horror. It is a story of how an entire legal and social structure was designed to prevent accountability. It is a story that implicates not just Margaret, but everyone who knew and said nothing. Everyone who had the power to stop it and chose not to exercise that power. Everyone who benefited from a system that made such things possible. The women on Margaret's plantation were not passive victims, though the historical record often presents them that way. Within the constraints of absolute captivity and systematic oppression, they engaged in forms of resistance that were subtle, that were often invisible to their oppressors, but that were nonetheless real. One documented case involves an enslaved woman named Rose, who appears to have deliberately avoided pregnancy despite repeated sexual assaults. This resistance manifested through consumption of herbs with contraceptive properties, knowledge passed down through generations of women, and through deliberate miscarriage when pregnancy could not be prevented. Margaret eventually recognized what was happening and responded by isolating Rose, by increasing surveillance, by threatening to sell her or her children. Rose eventually capitulated, but her initial resistance demonstrates that these women retained agency, even in circumstances designed to remove it entirely. Another form of resistance involved the creation and maintenance of family networks and genealogical knowledge, despite the system's attempt to separate families and erase kinship. Enslaved women on the plantation kept track of their children and their grandchildren. They told their children who their fathers were, even when that information was dangerous to know. They passed down their own names and their own histories. When freedom came, many of these women could provide genealogical information that confused and complicated the paternity records, that demonstrated the system's knowledge of violation even as it refused to acknowledge its own culpability. The most remarkable form of resistance came through what might be called cultural memory. The women on the plantation told their stories to their children and grandchildren. They did so carefully with discretion, often in whispered conversations or in coded language that could mean something else if overheard by white people. But they did so consistently. When emancipation came and black communities could speak more openly, these stories were shared with other community members, were written down by school teachers and missionaries, were gradually collected into archives that were not widely known but did exist. The descendants of the women violated by Margaret's operation knew their history. They knew that their light skin or their distinctive features connected them to white men through violence, not through choice. They knew that they were products of a calculated scheme. And they carried that knowledge as part of their identity, as part of their family history, even as the larger historical record attempted to pretend it had never happened. This continuity of memory, this preservation of truth through oral tradition, represents perhaps the most profound victory of the enslaved women. They ensured that the truth could not be completely erased, that when someone eventually asked the right questions, there would still be voices to answer. The women who survived Margaret's abuse lived into freedom, lived to see slavery abolished, lived to claim citizenship under the Reconstruction Amendments. Lucy, whose testimony we discussed earlier, lived to be 89 years old. She had her own home, her own land, and the satisfaction of seeing the legal system that had protected her abuser finally superseded by a new legal framework. Emma lived to 91, raising her own children and grandchildren in a community that knew her story and honored her survival. Other women died before emancipation, their stories known only through the fragmentary records and the memories of those who knew them. But even in death, these women achieved a kind of victory. Their bodies, which had been treated as mere property, as breeding vessels, became the evidence against the system that had attempted to treat them that way. Their children, the mixed-race children born from violation, were living monuments to slavery's inhumanity. As they moved through the world after emancipation, as they built their own families and communities, they carried with them the proof of what slavery had been capable of. They were the living refutation of slavery's claim to be a benevolent system, a civilizing force. They embodied the lie at slavery's center, the lie that enslaved people were somehow less human, somehow not quite entitled to the protection against violence that every human deserved. In their survival, in their persistence, in their refusal to disappear despite every effort to erase them, these women won a kind of victory that was denied to them in any official or legal sense. Margaret's family survived the Civil War with significant losses, but with the core of their wealth largely intact. The plantation infrastructure was destroyed, but the land remained valuable. The family that had built its fortune on enslaved labor shifted to new economic models: tenant farming, some industrial investment, entering into politics and business in ways that allowed them to maintain status and wealth into the 20th century. The sons who had participated in Margaret's breeding program lived respectable lives after the war. They married, had children, entered into business and professional pursuits. One became a successful lawyer. Another managed what remained of the family's land holdings. None of them ever publicly acknowledged what they had done. None of them ever expressed remorse. And none of them was ever held accountable by any legal mechanism. The family maintained its position in Georgia society well into the 20th century. It produced state legislators, successful business people, people of apparent respectability and standing. The dirty secret that had generated their wealth, the breeding program that had enriched them, faded into family obscurity. Perhaps some of them knew. Perhaps it was told as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what powerful people could get away with. Perhaps it was denied entirely, relegated to the status of rumor or exaggeration. We do not know because the family maintained careful control over its own narrative and over access to its own documentary record. In the 1990s and 2000s, as the story began to emerge publicly through the work of historians like Rebecca Caldwell and others, some of Margaret's family faced an uncomfortable reckoning. Descendants who discovered the truth about their ancestors' actions were forced to confront what their family history actually contained. Some attempted to deny or minimize what had occurred. Others, to their credit, attempted to engage honestly with the historical record. A few established educational foundations aimed at teaching Georgia's true history, including its most shameful elements. One descendant, a woman named Sarah, published a memoir in 2004 in which she discussed learning about Margaret's actions and the process of accepting that her family's wealth and status had been built on particularly vicious forms of exploitation. Sarah wrote about the difficulty of reconciling her love for her family with the historical reality of what they had done. She wrote about the process of seeking out descendants of the women her ancestors had violated, attempting to apologize, attempting to understand the continuing harm that such history might inflict. Sarah's book was not well received by some of her own family members who felt that she was airing family secrets, that she was betraying her ancestors, that she was accepting an exaggerated historical narrative. But other readers, particularly descendants of enslaved people with connections to Margaret's plantation, found value in her willingness to engage honestly with difficult history. Sarah's effort represented what might be called a family reckoning, though, of course, it could never fully repair the damage that had been inflicted. As historians have engaged with Margaret's case and similar cases that have emerged through the historical record, it has become clear that what Margaret did was not unique. It was an extreme example documented in detail through surviving records, but not fundamentally different from practices that occurred elsewhere. Historians have discovered references to breeding programs in South Carolina, in Mississippi, in Louisiana. They have found evidence of systematic sexual violence directed towards specific reproductive outcomes in places throughout the slaveholding South. What Margaret's case reveals is not an individual aberration, but rather the logical endpoint of a system that treated human beings as commodities capable of being improved and reproduced like livestock. This realization has forced a re-examination of how we understand slavery itself. Slavery was not just about labor. It was about reproducing itself, about creating new enslaved people to replace those who died or were sold, about maximizing the reproductive capacity of women's bodies. The violence against enslaved women in this context was not merely incidental brutality, but was actually essential to slavery's reproduction and profitability. It was deliberate. It was systematic. And for those willing to engage in it openly, like Margaret, it was protected by law. In the early 2000s, as genetic testing became more widely available and accessible, many descendants of enslaved people began to engage in genealogical research with new tools at their disposal. DNA testing provided confirmation of what had long been suspected or known: the extensive interracial mixing that had occurred under slavery. For some descendants of Margaret's victims, this genetic testing provided documentary proof of lineages that had been verbally transmitted but could never be officially confirmed. A woman named Tamara, descended from Lucy, one of Margaret's victims, discovered through DNA testing that she shared significant genetic material with the descendants of Margaret's sons. This discovery allowed her to trace her family history back through the plantation itself, to confirm the oral history that had been preserved in her family. Tamara has become an activist for truth-telling about slavery in Georgia. She works with museums and historical societies to ensure that stories like her ancestors are documented and preserved. She serves as a living bridge between Margaret's history and the present day, a voice that refuses to allow the crime to be forgotten or minimized. Other descendants have organized collectively. A group called the Georgia Slavery Descendants Alliance was formed to collect and preserve the stories of enslaved people from Georgia plantations, and to present these stories in educational contexts. The alliance is not primarily focused on extracting reparations or financial compensation, though these questions are not off the table. Rather, they are focused on ensuring that history is told accurately, that the record is not allowed to be rewritten by those who wish to minimize slavery's horrors. In 2015, a historical marker was placed at the site of Margaret's original plantation, which by that time had been subdivided and partially developed for residential and commercial use. The marker does not name Margaret due to family objections and historical uncertainty about details, but it does acknowledge the documented sexual violence and systematic breeding that occurred there. The placement of this marker was controversial. Some descendants of Margaret's family opposed it, arguing that it perpetuated a negative stereotype, that it reflected exaggerated or misinterpreted historical evidence, that public commemoration of family shame was inappropriate. Other members of the community argued in favor of it, noting that history ought not be hidden simply because it was uncomfortable or shameful. The marker has become a site of pilgrimage for some, a place where descendants of the victims come to acknowledge their history, to remember their ancestors, to claim their own place in Georgia's historical record. Every year on Emancipation Day in January, a group gathers at the marker. They read the names of the known victims. They share testimony from the historical record. They sing songs and offer prayers. The gathering is not large, usually 30 to 50 people, but its significance is enormous. It is an act of counter-memory and insistence that the historical record cannot be allowed to erase these women and their suffering. In 2019, the University of Georgia, where many of the documentary materials related to Margaret's case are housed, formally acknowledged the role that slavery played in its own institutional history, and committed to making documents related to slavery more widely available for research and education. This commitment included digitizing and providing open access to materials related to Margaret's case, materials that had previously been restricted or hidden away. The university also established a scholarship fund specifically for descendants of enslaved people from Georgia plantations, with preference given to descendants of women who had been subjected to sexual violence. One of the scholarship's first recipients was a great-great-great-granddaughter of Emma, one of Margaret's primary victims. This act of institutional acknowledgement and economic redress, while limited in scope, represented an important shift in how academic institutions were beginning to grapple with slavery's legacies. It did not undo the harm that had been inflicted. It did not restore what had been stolen. But it represented a willingness to acknowledge wrong and to begin a process of repair that might extend beyond mere historical documentation. The deliberate breeding of enslaved people, though practiced throughout the period of slavery in North America, became increasingly systematized and openly discussed after the invention of the cotton gin made slavery suddenly more profitable and more expandable. If slavery could be expanded westward, if new land could be developed for cotton production, if new markets could be cultivated, then slavery needed more enslaved people. The internal slave trade, which transported enslaved people from the Upper South to the Lower South and the frontier, became one response to this need. But breeding was another response. If enslaved women could be forced to have more children, if those children would automatically become enslaved property because their mothers were enslaved, then the enslaver could profit from reproduction itself, from the biological capacity of women's bodies. This logic, while applied across slavery, reached its most systematic extreme in cases where individual enslavers deliberately tried to maximize the reproductive capacity of specific enslaved women for specific purposes. Margaret's breeding program was an extension of this logic to its ultimate conclusion. She was simply taking slavery's own internal rationality to its most complete expression: the transformation of human beings into reproducible commodities. The fact that she did this deliberately, that she recorded her activities, that she involved